Throughout history, religion has played a fundamental role in shaping our societies and cultures. But in recent decades, religiosity has been on the decline, with a growing number of people choosing to identify as non religious, atheist, or just agnostic. Now, this shift has caused many to question the role of religion in modern society and whether it even still has any value. Now, rather than abandoning religion altogether, I think we should explore how we can reclaim religion and bring it back into our lives. I'm going to make some fairly radical claims in this and subsequent videos, but in this video series, we're going to delve into why religiosity has declined and uncover the deep insights in the human condition that don't just suggest we need religion, but that also point to the fact that the fundamental structure of the cosmos requires a religious paradigm to not only understand mechanically, but to appreciate philosophically. Impression of course, one of the foremost hits to our public consciousness about this increasing secularity happened in the throes of the cultural moment of the 1960s. The West stood on the precipice of significant cultural and religious change, of social and civil unrest, yet also of a renewed interest in the new Eastern spiritual and mystical movements, like the Hare Krishna movement, for example. The zeitgeist of the era was captured in a now iconic Time magazine cover page for its April 8, 1966 edition, asking the world if God was dead. Of course, a fictitious yet infamous madman of the Germanic heritage had asked the same thinking 70 years prior. But I think in breathing life back into this question, the editors at Time had clued in on a trend that was about to intensify. Of course, on its surface, it's an odd question to ask. We don't typically think of God as dead or alive. Devout believers may regard God as a supportive confidant, a strict disciplinarian, an affectionate redeemer, an indulgent grandparent, an austere instructor, or an ontological force. Conversely, fervent atheists may view God as a perilous illusion, a figment of fantasy, a manifestation of our moral ideals, a neural process operational in human brains, or just an affront to our rational faculties. The ambivalent agnostic, on the other hand, remains non-committal to the identity of God, speculating on the enigmatic possibilities. The strange thing is, the year Time magazine run their provocative headline, only 2% of Americans believe that God was actually dead, or at least dead enough for them not to bother with organized religion. That number hadn't changed for the prior 15 years, and while bumping up 8% in the 1970s, remained steady for over 2 decades afterward. While most polled Americans at the time had lived through the sanguine carnage of World War II and the economic ruin of the Great Depression, their faith remained as stubborn as ever. And God, he was as alive as ever. So what was Time magazine going on about exactly? So by the mid-1990s, something snapped out of place. Controlling for population, the number of non-believers had doubled. Then it tripled. Today, 1 in 3 of us is religiously unaffiliated. Generation Y keeps the pews empty out of choice, while the silent generation, the most religious of us, does so out of necessity. We're praying less, churching less, and caring less. In the words of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. We are ghosting God, and the exodus is only accelerating. But just like the Old Testament, I think we have to ask ourselves whether we're destined for the promised land or just circling the wilderness. The saga of how and why we stopped caring for God, religion, and the transcendent is one I hope to tell. Because religion once circumscribed our collective existence. We invented calendars, sacrificed animals, and erected monuments to placate the gods. There is no human society, wrote American sociologist Talcott Parsons, without something which modern social scientists would classify as religion. So peculiar is this behavior to humans rather, that amongst all the many names granted to our race, the most distinguishing might be Homo religiosus. We gesture with our arms and grunt with our voices at something beyond our physical world, a territory so fundamentally ineffable that we've embattled one another for centuries over how to articulate it. Yet, in the last few centuries, a covert operation was carried out in the name of rationality and enlightenment. It spread a dangerous lie, and that lie was that all there was to reality was physical stuff. A myth soon coalesced around this lie, relegating the immaterial transcendent realm to superstitious folklore, contrived fantasies of a primitive imagination, hardwired to see conscious agency in every bush and tree. The long and labored birth pangs of progress led to enlightenment in the 15th century and a foolproof scientific method that enabled transformative technology. We discovered that rather than relying on stories, we could better understand and control our world by breaking it down into smaller and smaller bits. It was a science of divide and conquer, and its effects were unmistakably positive. Now, that science spawned technology. That technology spurred industry. Industry created capital, and capital birthed consumerism. That last stop in the journey toward a post-God society, servicing and indulging every human need and want. This new myth consigns religion as but a vestigial organ of a bygone era to our private lives, with no place in the public square, the government corridor, or the university hall. In truth, religion was but an illusion to our warm and wet brains, a bogus coping mechanism meant to quell our fear of the unknown. Humans were nothing more or less than biology, and biology was nothing more or less than chemistry, and chemistry was nothing more or less than physics, which described the intrinsic stuff that constituted existence. The sooner people realize this, the better everyone would be. We'd be free of our superstitious shackles that had hobbled our ancestors and focus our time and attention on building a society based on the crisp edicts of humanism and the unassailable methods of science. It was the dawn of the secular human being. Of course, the theory that reality consists of nothing but physical matter is known as reductive materialism. And it isn't just wrong, it's dead wrong. It's flat earth level wrong. It also isn't science, but a rather lousy take on a branch of philosophy called metaphysics, which describes the ultimate nature and constitution of things. Metaphysicians ask strange questions like whether your thoughts about this video you're listening to are more real than the video itself. Reductive materialism is the metaphysical belief that things can be understood by breaking them apart into the smallest possible bits that contain mass or energy. Anything that defies a materialistic explanation is either an illusory personal construct or an arbitrarily defined social construct. In either case, though, they're nothing more than the byproduct of neurons made out of stuff. No gods, no spirits, no free will, nowhere to transcend to, just subatomic particular stuff that came into being with a hot big bang and would disappear from being with a cold, quiet whimper. Now, reductive materialism isn't the only theory of metaphysics. Dualists, for example, they believe the world comprises of two fundamentally different stuff, matter and mind. The mind part is fundamentally made out of other stuff than the matter. Think of it a little bit like a computer. A computer could never feel the smell of a rose or the taste of blue cheese, no matter how many ones or zeros it strings together. We can never logically describe matter in terms of mind or mind in terms of matter. In the same way, we can never fully describe the taste of blue cheese with ones and zeros, and the taste of blue cheese can never be reduced to ones or zeros. Now, there's a third group of people. They're known as idealists, and they believe that all there is to existence is the mind, and that the physical world is just a convenient three-dimensional user interface that our minds construct to render other minds. Now, if God is indeed dead, if God is indeed dead, reductive materialism would have been the screed written by his murdering scientists, fastidiously operating within the irrational confines of their craft. The irony, of course, is that the decline of religion and the transcendent in general accelerated at the exact same time that scientists were unwittingly discovering how utterly incompatible reductive materialism was with the latest evidence from modern physics and cognitive science. These findings, of course, have yet to percolate into the public consciousness. So, for now, the reductive materialism enjoys a de facto position of rationality in the minds of most quote-unquote rationalists. I'll be honest, it certainly lured me in personally as an angsty adolescent and teenager looking to make sense of his empirical science and the revealed religion he was raised with. The benefits of science are palpably obvious, but with religion, the benefits are a little more subtle. After all, why does one need religion or faith or transcendent and all its storytelling frills if reductive materialism could explain all my experiences of the natural world? My parents had raised me to fear God and respect the good book as a revelation of his plan for my life. The scriptures had brokered my relationship with the transcendent, supported by a cast of televangelists and Orthodox priests, of course. Teachers and students had pinned me as the Bible boy in elementary school, which, while cementing my identity, didn't earn me much social capital in the schoolyard. By high school, however, the doubts had started to worm their way into my faith, so I doubled down on my fundamentalism, thumping my Bible as a vociferous young earth creationist throughout the 12th grade. It was an awkward moment of my life to think that Ken Ham was an apologist paragon, but it certainly gave me the confidence to strut around barking about the differences between microevolution and macroevolution as though the edifice of Christianity depended on it. My science teacher at the time, God bless him, was as patient as he was instructive, and encouraged me to reconcile my beliefs instead of fighting a battle my side had effectively lost decades ago. But by university, I soon discovered and felt the magnitude of that defeat. Our first-year biology course hammered evolutionary biology into us so decisively that it shattered my biblical literalism. My faith, so dependent on a historical Adam, hung in the balance. The Genesis creator but a lecture or two away from obsolescence. The broader social atmosphere fueled my uncertainty. The late 2000s was the heyday of a full-out culture war on religion, spearheaded by the new atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and stoked by the September 11th attacks and the War on Terror. The existential struggle between progressive atheism and regressive religion radiated holy war vibes in more ways than one. I personally swung from a Richard Dawkins atheistic rejection of the transcendence to a Meister Eckhartian mystical embrace of it. It was a dizzying and confusing time, but in hindsight, it's not hard to see why. Without realizing it, I was being hoodwinked into the philosophical baloney of reductive materialism. In a final effort to escape the choking constraints of the evolution-creation debate, my like-minded friends and I explored alternative approaches to reading Scripture. We discovered allegorical readings of the Bible, and it was nothing short of a godsend. Historically pioneered by the Alexandrian Church and in the fetal stages of the Church's development, allegory was all the more fashionable to us because its leading proponent was an Alexandrian theologian of Egyptian roots. In the face of controversy in the early Church, this man, Origen, completely reimagined how to read the Old Testament by connecting it with the New Testament through the use of allegory, which recast Jesus, the main protagonist of the New Testament and arguably the Scriptures writ large, and extending his historical significance outside the Gospels and into symbolic and prophetic appearances in the Old Testament. This reaffirmed his divinity, so Origen thought, and hardened the case for including the Old Testament in the final scriptural canon, which only concretized a century after Origen's death anyways. Origen was excommunicated after his death for unrelated reasons, and that only added to his mystique to us. Now, for our small group of friends, allegory was the bed of embers that basically kept our faith from smoldering. Its flexible methods fanned intense Friday night debates at a McDonald's near our church, where we had the real youth group meet after youth group. Allegory, which is a way of reading the Old Testament through the use of symbol and metaphor and analogy, transformed the Bible into a giant jigsaw puzzle of subtle symbols and literary devices that, if we could just piece together, would give us the complete picture of each writer's true intention, while emancipating us from having to justify the literal sense of every page tortuously. Frankly, it renewed our relationship with Scripture and made us feel like we were onto something. Allegorical methods in general demand the reader to pack a different set of assumptions when journeying into a text, and forces the reader to look beyond the, quote, obvious meaning and into intention and subtext. Scholars call allegory a, quote, hermeneutic lens because it frames and colors how we read and interpret a passage. I mean, you'd never crack open a Shakespeare hoping to get the chemical formula for love, so why was I flipping through Genesis to figure out how old rocks were? Frankly, using allegory to make sense of ancient stories in a modern world typifies how many people reconcile their faith and rationality even today. For me, back then, as much as allegory helped, its application sometimes felt a little arbitrary and constrained. While some stories lent themselves beautifully to allegory, vast swaths of scriptures felt immune to it. My job of making sense of the Bible and the transcendent realm it gestured at was half done. But now that I had part of the puzzle, it was only fair that I turned my attention to the rest of my beliefs, the ones that were less concordant with religion. That hermeneutical lens that I had to step back from and examine was reductive materialism. It was the, quote, literalism that I was applying to the Bible. Reductive materialism was the same sort of literalism that I was taking to understanding my experiential world. Of course, at the time, I didn't quite articulate it that way. At the time, I just wanted to make sense of what I knew to be valid outside the transcendent realm and make it neatly fit with my religious beliefs. Really, I was in search for a demilitarized zone between rationality and religion, and I think it was a reasonable ask. Just as truth, for example, coheres across disparate disciplines, if there's anything true, good, beautiful about the transcendent or my faith, it had to gel with our collective experience of reality. So I went down a winding path exploring countless disjointed topics like number theory, complex systems, ancient philosophy, art, consciousness, sociology, stability, metaphysics. These set of videos organizes where I've landed and presents a radical hypothesis on the origins of the religious impulse, how that impulse manifests through religious traditions, what our intuition has to really say about reality and how we can ultimately reconcile that with religion. What we're going to find out is how vital transcendence is in maintaining the infrastructure of every belief system, including rationality. And contrary to what the lie of reductive materialism has to say, that has brainwashed us into believing, embracing transcendence doesn't relinquish rationality. Instead, it allows us to accept it and all the weirdness that rationality actually entails. And so that's my bias, and it's one I'm prepared to stay vigilant about and refer back to as we trek through this journey. Our story here isn't an apology for the Christian faith. I really try to draw on many religious traditions and scientific truths so that each may bask in the concrete realities and eternal mysteries of the other. Now, Christianity is the source code on which our Western institutional software is run on. It's certainly my software, so it's fair that I give it detailed consideration. Now, a caveat before continuing. English, really any language, is hopelessly impoverished to describe the rapture of transcendence and a true religious experience. To presume that words can convey a transcendent, multisensory experience would be as presumptuous as using musical notes, for example, to describe the taste of cinnamon. And that's why Christian liturgical traditions, for example, use the smell of incense, the vision through iconography, and taste through communion to celebrate their understanding of the transcendent. Our human species must draw on all its sensual inputs to recreate the one thing that sits outside of it, the transcendent experience. So as we journey towards making sense of religion, we're going to take the liberty to investigate all channels of truth, from mathematics to history, sociology, science, philosophy, and religion, and we're going to find out if they too might lead us to the transcendent. Of course, our project here is of utmost urgency. People have never abandoned organized religion with as much zeal as they are today. Since the mid-1990s, the number of religious Americans has decreased by a third. By 2070, unaffiliated individuals will outnumber Christians in the US and, frankly, already have in other Western nations. Germany, the crib of Protestantism, now has fewer people attending church than not attending church, while more than half of their neighbors in the Netherlands are no longer religiously affiliated. In the United Kingdom, the number of religiously unaffiliated people nearly doubled according to a 2021 census. Australia, Canada, and other Western nations are trending similarly. Of course, when presented with this data, it's difficult not to invoke the most obvious culprit: money. On average, people in rich countries are less religious than people in developing countries, and higher incomes tend to discourage religiosity, with the US being a notable global exception. The conventional wisdom is that as people become wealthier, they lose faith in God and the institutions that have historically kept him relevant. But the reality is there are simply too many confounding variables to believe that this inverse correlation between wealth and religion is causative. For instance, some of the most financially successful religious Americans are also the most educated. The Middle East and India have both experienced parabolic economic growth in the last few decades, with the vast majority of both parts of the world still believing in God. In China, the preeminent example of economic growth in the latter quartile of the 20th century, the number of Christians in China grew by 10% yearly for nearly 40 years, by the way, and that outpaced economic growth. Meanwhile, in Africa, Catholicism has exploded by an astonishing 6,708% over the century, even as its nations industrialized. So while sociologists agree that cultural factors account for much of the variation in religiosity between rich and emerging countries, with a few caveats, the losing of faith is distinctly a Western trend. Now, you might also be forgiven for assuming this trend is most pronounced among scientists. But this is where our story takes an even stranger turn. Scientists are a diverse bunch of people, and while generally less religious, only 1 in 5 think they got that way after launching their careers. What's more peculiar is that 46% of scientists over the age of 65 believe in the transcendent, yet 66% of scientists under the age of 35 believe in the same thing. In other words, young scientists are starting to negotiate the relationship with transcendence in religion and science. Religion isn't waning as much as it's changing. The bursting of popularity for public personas like Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke recast religious mythology and ancient philosophy in the language of modern psychology and cognitive science. It illustrates this pent-up demand to weave the old with the new. And it's also why, despite the increase in unaffiliated people, often described as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, there's been a significant drop in the percentage of religious people who now believe their faith conflicts with science. And that's a trend that is showing signs of acceleration. The picture is even more complicated if we peel away the nun label. They come in various flavors, as some don't believe in religion, some don't attend church, and others aren't even part of a religious community. Only 15% of nuns in the US meet all 3 criteria, and they oscillate between categories constantly. For example, they're just as likely to return to church as they are to become full-blown atheists. Most nuns believe in souls, spirits, demons, the afterlife, ghosts, despite rejecting its institutional zookeepers. Free of creed, nuns cling to vestiges of a transcendent belief system, with nearly 40% still identifying as spiritual but not religious. Now, in business jargon, these spiritual but not religious people would constitute a captive consumer segment demanding a response from the marketplace. Unsurprisingly, a bazaar of ideas has sprung up to service them. Chief among its merchants is Deepak Chopra, who distinguishes between the spiritual and religious, and who services, quote, the spiritual aspirant on a pathless journey of self-discovery, following not a set of external rules, but their own inner call to spirit, a rebellious act of going solo and leaving the tribe. Trading in the currency of Eastern mysticism and peddling a mishmash of meditation, quantum woo, Gnosticism, alternative medicine, pop psychology, and yoga, Chopra even offers a detox kit on his website to be used as part of a complete detoxification program that includes mind-body practices such as a light plant-based diet. It retails for $165. The grift has garnered significant negative attention from an unsuspecting coalition of Christian fundamentalists, pagans, indigenous peoples, and academics. One common criticism is that it conflates self-knowledge with religious wisdom, and even more liberal detractors see it as just another incarnation of the individualistic spirit of modern capitalist society, which distracts people from solving collective problems. Now, there's no doubt the landscape of belief is evolving, but not in immediately apparent ways. Because while we collectively shift away from traditional religion in the West, the impulse which undergirds the need for faith hasn't disappeared, and society is taking more liberty in experimenting with custom-built transcendental systems for specific use cases, while we're making more efforts to make it click with science. A German historian about a century ago, his name is Oswald Spengler, called out the rise of, quote, philosophies of digestion, nutrition, and hygiene, vegetarianism treated with religious earnestness. The decline of religiosity hasn't done much to quell the impulse behind it. On the contrary, its supposed repression has only rechanneled the restless energy that characterizes the innate transcendent impulse into other enterprises like politics, business, and social justice. For these reasons, and despite its alliterative allure, our journey isn't about reclaiming religion per se. In calling out the transcendent, I really want to draw attention to the more germane undercurrents that could only be described as a impulse for the transcendent, something that sits beyond us, which often manifests as religious conviction. Investigating the source of this transcendent impulse is going to be a crucial element in our story. The intellectual beatdown on traditional religion has been relentless in recent years, thanks to social media and YouTube. The response to it has been predictably polemical, either a doubling down on the fundamentalism or a concession on long held traditions. There's even a Wikipedia page cataloging what I found were Christian atheists. Now, maintaining a level headed and balanced approach to this situation is a daunting task, as acknowledging people's doubts can potentially expose one to the very forces one seeks to unpack. Consequently, it's often much simpler to disregard the withering attacks and either revert to a conservative fundamentalism or adopt a liberal kumbaya. The new atheists that we encountered earlier were my first dragons that I had to slay. Frankly, I thought they had a smug and self-assured veneer. Characterized by their glib and often persuasive takedowns of religion, its four horsemen were relentless in their assaults on the faith. They left no stone unturned in their harem against religion. They deconstructed scripture, listed the evils wrought in God's name, and erased his relevance from the science textbook, all with a relaxed, disarming, matter-of-fact demeanor. And while their movement has since waned, their books remain influential even today. Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion spent weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was downloaded nearly 3 million times in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I spent my formative years in my early 20s gobbling up their books and fastidiously replying to them in long screeds on Facebook. My religious community, however, took a less measured approach in the face of the culture wars. In Sunday school, we were told that some doubt was healthy, but too much of it indicated more nefarious forces at work. After all, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled, wrote Charles Baudelaire, was convincing the world that he didn't exist. Satan's deceit knew no bounds, and after being asked to make sense of dinosaur bones millions of years ago with an Adam who lived 6,000 years ago, I distinctly recall one Sunday school teacher telling us that Satan had actually buried the dinosaur bones just to dupe the scientists into thinking that the Earth was older than it was. Tantalizing. The reality is, religious communities go to absurd lengths to distance themselves from anything resembling a threat to the established orthodoxy, much to their detriment, as I soon discovered. My friends decided to survey our Coptic community in the thick of the culture wars on religion. We started a survey monkey to pull our peers on why they thought people turned their back on religion. And of the 200 responses we received, nearly 40% of answers blamed either unsatisfactory teaching or creeping secularization. Our findings had actually agreed with larger-scale surveys showing that 1 in 2 nuns left their childhood faith because they stopped believing. When those studies asked why, logic, science, and lack of evidence frequently came up. Of those who say they didn't stop believing but left anyways, 2 in 5 left because they despised the institution, citing the divisiveness of religion, the hypocrisy of its adherents, and the net harm the religion in general inflicted on society. The reality is that people are more likely to believe a claim if it agrees with their broader worldview, and herein lies why religious people and the religious landscape is changing so rapidly. Religious engagement today suffers because it fails to situate itself into the evolving web of secular belief and challenge it on its own terms. This, by extension, impairs our ability to articulate the transcendent and commune with it properly. People really require coherent stories to order their lives, and the disjointed one that modernity fails to deliver on often leaves the religious story wanting. Early Christians were aware of this need and used it to their advantage. First century Palestine was rife with Greco-Roman ideas, and Christian writers, looking to persuade others to join the faith, shamelessly appropriated Hellenic grammar and Roman mythology to retell their experience with the transcendent. It was an intellectual and mythical tradition that people like St. Justin Martyr drew on in his first apology when he wrote, "And when we also say that the Word, who is the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem the sons of Jupiter." Later, he compares aspects of Jesus' life with the lives of Mercury, Hercules, and Asclepius. Justin Martyr carried a tradition that the Apostle Paul makes explicit in the book of Acts. Speaking to the, quote, men of Athens, Paul tells them that their altar to the unknown God was the same God that he was proclaiming. Those men of Athens influenced how the gospel writers describe Jesus himself. The Word, in the Gospel of John's opening salvo, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," is the Logos, a profoundly significant term for the Greek reader. Logos is a verbal noun that means counting, reckoning, or explaining. First articulated by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus 400 years before Christ, and built upon by the first century Jewish philosopher Philo, Logos was the principle of intelligibility and order, the ground of all existence. It was the secret interpretive key by which we could understand reality, allowing us to make sense of the world. It was a simulacrum of God himself. The Logos was God.exe. And by equating Jesus with Logos, John was saying that this mysterious force of the nature, spoken of by the Greeks for hundreds of years, had taken on human flesh and was the main protagonist of his gospel. Now the rabbis, in turn, had appropriated Greek ideas for over 200 years before St. John, toying with the concept of Logos in their so-called wisdom literature. They conceived Logos as not only a principle of the universe, but a living being enacting the will of the Creator. So personal was this force that she, and it is a she, became his handmaiden. The apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon describes the relationship between this wisdom Logos and God. Quote, "For she is a breath of the power of God, and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore nothing defiled gains entrance into her, for she is a reflection of the eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness." Close the quote. Now, the Christian message was frankly at home in the Greek mind because it embraced the linguistic building blocks of the classical philosophy of the Greco-Roman world. But when social mores start to tinker with the meaning of words, the transcendent impulse finds less of a ground to stand on, and as words drift, ideas drift, and so do people. Organized religion imbues its faithful with a story about the transcendent realm. My personal account had a panoply of supernatural characters supervising a world that, though fallen, would be redeemed thanks to a cosmic reversal of cosmic fortune initiated by an act of love. The Logos had taken on the form of an individual many centuries ago and had died for the life of this world. We heard it every Sunday. But by the time we entered high school, the rift between religion and everything else widened. By college, it was an uncrossable chasm. The reductive materialistic world and the vocabulary that it had imbued us with had effectively alienated us from the transcendent. Even when those two worldviews agreed on a term, the similarities were more in form and less in substance. Take the concept of love. In everyday parlance, love is the strong affection accompanied by behaviors meant to display or cement that attraction. Millions of years of evolution selected love as the illusion that would maximize the probability of an animal seeking a mate and caring for its offspring. Love is ancient, with evidence showing the parent-offspring bond being over 200 million years old. This bond is crucial to love's evolutionary development as it increases the likelihood of the offspring's survival. As a precursor to the institution of marriage, monogamy developed as a stable equilibrium between the quantity-focused male mating strategy and the quality-first female mating strategy. And when science reaches its explanatory limit in describing love, we turn the baton to history and sociology to appreciate how this amorous delusion has evolved over time. In ancient Greece, love was regarded as consisting of base instincts, but also having the potential for profound connection with wisdom and beauty. The romantic variant of love, however, is a more recent phenomenon, experienced in the voluminous poems penned by lovers across the ages. Originating in the mystical traditions of the Sufis, romantic love was subsequently adopted by the troubadours in the Middle Ages, who helped elevate it to the level of poetic fine art. As Europe grew in its global reach through trade and affluence, love similarly took on more materialistic overtones, and by the 20th century, this trend had crystallized, further cementing love's link to material gain and possession. Now, my church had a very different view of love. The Christian conception of love was that it was more than any of that. Love, for the Christian, is a person. Now, again, to a modern, sensible person, this is mistaking a verb with a noun. It's a category error. Aren't people made of physical stuff like atoms? Love, on the other hand, that's just the subjective experience of specific neurons firing particular chemicals in the right amounts at the right times in the right places. What evolution found helpful, capitalism found valuable, nationalism found exploitable, and lovers found erotic. Love manifests through flesh and blood people, but it wasn't one itself, at least not in the reductive materialistic world. Now, the question at hand is a perplexing one. What exactly constitutes a human being? A simplistic answer could be offered through the lens of, again, reductive materialism. But the transcendent realm, or its perspectives, implicates non-physical facets such as spirit, soul, will, and mind. It raises further inquiries about the distinctions between mind, soul, and spirit. Is the soul simply another appellation for the spirit? Perhaps the spirit, or mind, arises from us in the same way that music springs forth from a piano. This enigmatic metaphor begets another puzzle. Who is the composer, the pianist, the conductor? Then comes the crucial issue of the interface. How does the non-physical element of free will connect with the physical brain? Distinguishing the signal from the noise here can be quite arduous, and metaphors can lead to as many quandaries as they do solutions. So, in light of these overwhelming uncertainties, the lifeboat of reductive materialism appears all the more inviting amidst the turbulent seas of confusion. Of course, the problem here is that modern definitions supplant ancient ones, and when that happens, the broader picture gets complicated. The early church communicated its experience through a hermeneutic lens of Greek philosophy. But with today, Plato mostly untaught and largely forgotten, it's harder for the average person to embed the transcendent into their worldview. The result is a gradual drifting from transcendence. Stories about the transcendent are often most effective when relayed in the language of the prevailing time, which is made all the more complex by the exclusionary doctrine of reductive materialism. When people who advocate for the transcendent engage with secularism, they're often compelled to waste time on proving historical precision, biblical infallibility, and logical cohesiveness, which draws attention away from the more critical duty of uniting all truths under the transcendent umbrella. This task is particularly daunting. We must harmonize the transcendent with the greater fabric of truth that the world has been creating for the past 500 years. Although there are ongoing attempts to reconcile religion and science, they appear stilted and appeasing. It's no surprise that investigative fields such as journalism and academia have shifted away from treating the transcendence as a serious subject matter worth exploring. Of course, the narrative told by scholars and journalists on the demise of the transcendent often framed as the converse of the rise of reason, prove to be genuinely gripping sometimes. Notable works by people like Mark Taylor or Peter Watson, in their books like entitled After God and The Age of Atheists, respectively, stand as prime examples. Karen Armstrong's A History of God offers enlightening insights into the historical antecedents of the Judeo-Christian concept of God. Similarly, The Evolution of God traces the movement of ideas on the Creator throughout different centuries and cultures and time periods, duly imprinting their mark on the God we recognize today. In Doubt, a History, atheism can be traced back to a philosopher from the 6th century BC in India. Each of these books, and many others like them, offer a one-of-a-kind perspective on the decline of faith and uses various scholars, philosophers, and artists to trace the historical roots of the transcendent impulse. In the words of one critic, however, reading about the history of these things will, quote, leave the faithful gnawed at. All these stories ultimately arrive at the same conclusion. The arc of history irrevocably bends towards critical examination and ultimately skepticism. Drawing a biblical analogy, the curiosity and skepticism of a young David overcomes the self-assured superstition of Goliath. All it takes is a few well-timed questions in the right places. One such spot is all the pain and suffering wrought by religion. The reductive materialist paradigm would have us believe that religion evolved because of its benefits, but has no place in modern society because we've successfully exported all its valuable functions into the secular institutions. After all, we no longer visit monasteries to see the doctor. In the afterword of his bestseller, Sapiens, Yuval Harari encourages the reader to recognize that, quote, we are more powerful than ever before, but we have very little idea of what to do with all that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever. Self-made gods with only the laws of physics to keep us company. We are accountable to no one. Close the quote. Accountable to no one. Now that sounds liberating, but on reflection cries isolation and loneliness. Worthy of a lamentation, really. According to Nietzsche, the death of God, quote, wipes away the horizon with a sponge, close the quote. That leaves us devoid of the stars that had us staring at the sky in awe for millennia. And I think because of that, now is more than ever the time to reclaim religion and the transcendent. Because too many of us grew up with religion everywhere, believing the purpose it told us we had, while living under the moral code it demanded us to follow, but now find it challenging to see its relevance anywhere. Too many of us treat religion like a side hustle, to be casually indulged in on a weekly basis, but otherwise operating silently as we go about our tasks of life. Religion has become a habit for such people. But habit breeds weariness, and to reclaim transcendence is for the weary. The weariness of hearing aphorisms like taking a leap of faith, and that God won't give you more than you can handle. The weariness and fatigue of being told that religion is limited to answering why, but not how. Weariness of being infantilized, exhausted by the pithy comparisons of God with Zeus, Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, or the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Exhausted from hearing that religion isn't based on evidence and there should therefore be dismissed without evidence. That we should, quote, at all times shun the transcendent, close the quote. That we should have to accept the clash between science and faith. That we should have to abandon faith for reason. And if we are gnawed at by unresolved doubts, then maybe it is time to reclaim religion. If we wax nostalgic for the days when we could believe in miracles without hesitation, superstition, or a snicker, then it is time to reclaim religion. If we choke on the bittersweet fruit of the tree of knowledge, ever since discovering that first book that blog, book, subreddit, or YouTube video that hurled us into cynicism and skepticism. Maybe it is time to reclaim religion. If we like the sound of transcendence, but, like an imperfectly tuned violin, find it discordant with the rest of the orchestra, then maybe it's time to reclaim religion. If we find that science, wielding Occam's razor, sometimes pierces too deeply in places it has no business cutting, then maybe it is time to reclaim religion. If we feel alienated by priests and clerics who've wielded their power for ill will, then let us discover what the transcendent leadership is about by reclaiming religion. If we appreciate the value of religion, but see the dogmatic details often distracting from spirituality, then maybe it's time that we rethought religion. To truly reclaim religion, we have to challenge the idea that our everyday lives can have meaning without transcendental purpose. For our entire lives, we communed with the transcendent through religion, but the divisions wrought about by differences in dogma, culture, and language give us, and many people today, pause on the validity of the entire enterprise. Our story today and in the future will make a case as to why this impulse is not only natural, but why repressing it will not only manifest in bizarre and pernicious ways. We will also make great efforts to justify religion using the same tools and techniques often levied against it. Now, of course, justification is a tricky business. Having good reasons to believe in something doesn't make it accurate or true. But the transcendent makes explicit claims about objective reality, claims that we can test in the face of scientific scrutiny and philosophical inquiry. And just as truth can be discovered by intersecting various lines of evidence to find the symmetries that our universe is made of, we too can take creative license to explore the harmonic oscillations between disparate fields of the human project and discover and bisect where religion is true. We're going to revisit that Time magazine article, albeit 60 years too late, to explore its broader context of how we lost our religious sensibilities. We're going to find out that religion is worth preserving and redeeming, and how we could rescue them today with the same arsenal of ideas commonly used to dismantle religion. Now, this is going to be a long journey, but we need to first outline how the transcendent experience is like and what it means and feels like to different people. We're going to also take a closer look at some of the more bizarre yet well-documented aspects of the transcendent experience, the so-called psi phenomenon, as proof of the reality of the transcendent realm. We're going to then explore an obscure mathematical hypothesis to help us better understand the perennial impulse for religion. And finally, we're going to link this transcendent impulse as the key to underwriting the stability of our cherished institutions. Those institutions, we're going to then discover how our fallen natures and how this concept of a fallen nature really manifests throughout various aspects of religion and in science. We're going to discover how corrupted this transcendent impulse has become through the centuries and the various people and events that led to modernity. We're going to journey through the dark recesses of the consequences of denying this impulse and how it maps to the institutional failure we see today. It'll be a bit of a forensic investigation into the death of God, which will lead us into the nihilism of reductive materialism and its ultimate self-contradictory nature. Then we're going to build on this to discover a metaphysical case for re-embracing the transcendent in our modern lives. We're going to rediscover an obscure idea first articulated 300 years ago that holds the key to reconciling transcendence and rationality. For now, suffice to say that religion, like theology, is about images, and images are about reality. Science and theology are ultimately both descriptions of reality. Each is a construct of symbols pointing to a more profound truth that our fallen, error-prone sensual experiences cannot access. It's an astonishing conclusion not just of philosophers living today, but of ones who have lived for centuries ago. And finally, at the end of this journey, I hope that you appreciate how our religious heritage, from creation to spirits, God, evil, and salvation, emerges from a rational worldview of the world. Our vision here is to bootstrap a robust religious narrative that only considers our basic intuitions about the world to rediscover the true, deep meaning of religion. Ultimately, this is going to lead to a metaphysical position that stands in sharp contrast to reductive materialism. So, for now, let's aim for the heavens and see how close